get started. It's my pleasure today to introduce Jim Pedgrift. He's a retired math lecturer, having spent over 20 years working here at Sonoma State University. His degrees include a math and philosophy degree from UC Berkeley, then a master's in math from NC State, and he has continued his studies, including more recently getting a master's in history and philosophy of science from Indiana University. He spent many semesters out of his working life here as a visiting scholar, having worked in Budapest, Toronto, Melbourne, my hometown, Madison, Wisconsin, in Minnesota, and at Indiana University. It was in Indiana University this past fall as a visiting scholar where he participated in a class called Big Science, Changes in Science from World War II and the Growth of Anti-Science as a Movement in the United States. His prior, and it was out of this class that he sent me an email saying, I've just been through this discussion of this, I'm seeing what physicists do looks like. I'd be interested in presenting some ideas about this rise of anti-science or rise of an effort to delegitimize science. And I said, that sounds exactly on topic for us. So he has spent 4 years on the Santa Rosa Board of Education, 8 years on the Santa Rosa City Council, including 2 terms as mayor. He was the mayor of Santa Rosa. But a smaller thing compared to being a long-time attendee of What Physicists Do. Yay! And frequent speaker in the Math Colloquia series. Talks on the history of science, talks about the math of politics and elections, and including he gave a talk in the math series on the first scientific estimates on the size of the atom. Following this visit to Indiana, as I said, he spoke to me and he was wanted to talk about these ideas. I think it will be very interesting to hear his perspective on efforts to delegitimize the scientific methodology. Let's welcome Jim Pedgrift.
Thank you, Scott, and thank all of you for coming. And I know that there's some regulars out here who come every month, as I have for the last 29 years. And it's always a pleasure to hear reports from the frontiers of science, whether it be physics or astronomy. It's always exciting whenever I leave. This is going to be a little different. This might be a bit of a downer. I hope it's not off topic here from your interest. Let me show you what I hope we can get through here today. In outline, I'm going to start here with some definitions that we need in order to understand all that I'll be saying thereafter, making important distinctions here. And then we're going to be looking at one of the the historic source of anti-science, going back to the mid-20th century here, the Tobacco Institute. We'll look at some environmental issues that have taken place over the last half of the 20th century in which certain patterns of behavior are repeated over and over and over again. And then we'll try to understand those. What are we looking at here, which I refer to as disinformation techniques. And lastly, we'll look at the George C. Marshall Institute. Is there anyone in the room who's familiar with the Marshall Institute? Only one hand goes up. Well, this won't be new to you, but for the rest of you folks, it will be new, perhaps surprising, and maybe even a little bit alarming. We'll start with the definition, and if you ever need a good definition here of a sort of a philosophical nature, I recommend the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, that's online, an outstanding resource. Pseudoscience. We're here to talk about anti-science. So at least you confuse that with pseudoscience. Well, is that kind of the same? No, not at all. Pseudoscience, a claim, belief, or practice which is incorrectly presented as scientific, but does not adhere to valid scientific method, cannot be tested, or otherwise fails to conform to accepted scientific norms. Pseudoscience wants to be science, wants to be considered science, but doesn't quite measure up. Now, the classic case today of something that had been considered pseudoscience but has evolved into mainstream science is continental drift. So here was a theory first put forward about 1915, thereabouts, by a German scientist, Wegener, whose expertise actually was in meteorology. He was a little bit out of his subject area, but the idea had been floated before him, but he made a serious effort to bring scientific evidence to bear. But for his day, the evidence that he brought was not sufficient for his theory to be generally accepted by the scientific community. It was on the fringe. It might be it did not adhere to accepted scientific norms. It was pseudoscience for its day. The next ensuing half century, technologies develop, which enables the addition of evidence brought to bear. And suddenly, where there had been a theory with holes in it, perhaps, that didn't adhere to scientific norms, grows into something that now is mainstream science. I'm guessing there's not a person in the room that doubts the veracity of continental drift. But at one time, it was pseudoscience. And there are other things that might have been accepted more readily, but subsequent evidence says no longer. So the distinction between science and pseudoscience is nebulous, and perhaps it evolves over time. Anti-science. Anti-science. A position that rejects science and the scientific method. People holding anti-scientific views do not accept that science is an objective method as it purports to be, or that it generates universal knowledge. Anti-science attempts to delegitimize science whenever scientific evidence is brought to bear in a controversy in opposition to their own position. So I hope you understand the distinction between pseudoscience and anti-science. Well, pseudoscience would like to be considered science. Anti-science, In fact, anti-science would say, you guys, you scientist bunch here, you're a bunch of elitists. You think you have all the answers. Well, one day you say this is true, and then later you say, no, that was wrong, and now it's this. And some things that were part of the scientific mainstream have fallen off the table completely, subsequently proven to be false. So you scientist types, you're not the end-all, be-all of knowledge here. In fact, I suspect, and this is just my own speculation, that people who engage in anti-science oftentimes have something that they hold of value greater than science. And you say, well, what could be more valuable than truth? Oh, well, you don't have a monopoly on the truth, Mr. Scientist. Well, where would be sources of anti-science? Well, I'm sure that if I asked you for a suggestion, I'm guessing a majority of people in the room would have said, well, possibly religion. Anti-science and religion. Science is seen as reductionist, materialistic, anti-spiritual. It's believed to undermine traditional values and possibly ethnic and or religious identity. Science replaces faith with reason and group identity with some sort of cosmopolitan universalism. So what religion might be holding at greater value than science would be perhaps the literal reading of sacred texts. So we're having a dispute, and you say, oh, well, look, science supports your point of view. I don't care. I've got scripture supporting my point of view. That would be anti-scientific. Got an eager thumb here. I keep skipping a slide. Anti-science from the political left. And again, here we're living in a blue county in a blue state, and I'm guessing most of the majority of people in the room think of yourselves as liberals or progressives. And you go, well, we're not anti-scientific. Au contraire. Anti-science from the political left. Science is identified with the political right, of course. It's conservative, it's conformist, it's resistant to change, and possibly reflecting a Eurocentric and masculine worldview. Certain areas of studies are associated with racism or neocolonialism. We're not going to concentrate on the sources of anti-science that either come from religion, that would be another lecture. The relationship between science and religion goes back to the beginnings of the scientific revolution. And the relationship is one of tension, but it hasn't been constant over the centuries. It comes and goes. Currently, I would guess that the majority of mainstream believers in this country today don't have a beef with science. But there is a small, vocal, passionate minority that we hear about all the time who do take exception to certain scientific positions. Political left, how about them? And again, we're not going to concentrate on them today, primarily because there are no think tanks receiving literally millions of dollars from giant multinational corporations encouraged to, get that anti-science out there in the public. Anti-science from the left is pretty subjective and individual. If it's institutionalized anywhere, it would probably be here in academia with our colleagues across the quad. We're not going to go there today. We're looking at, I keep getting two, we're looking at anti-science from the political right. Science is identified with the political left. Contemporary right-wing anti-science is characterized by appeals to conspiracy theories to explain why consensus science claims whatever it does. This is intended to undermine the confidence with which the public holds science. Now, anti-science from the political right is well organized. There was a first lady who, somewhere in the 1990s, spoke about a vast right-wing conspiracy. She got some blowback in the press. Poor choice of words. Conspiracy sort of indicates that there's secret meetings and hidden agendas. No. Totally mistaken. No. There's no conspiracy. There is, however, a vast right-wing network of folks who all think alike and all receive generous donations of money from Enron or Mobil, ExxonMobil, the Koch brothers, tobacco companies, chemical companies, who say, yeah, you guys, we like what you guys have to put out. We'll be looking at that in greater detail here in just a minute. So we're focusing here on anti-science from the political right. Go back in history a little bit to the middle of the 20th century. Now, most of you folks are young, but I'm looking at some graybacks that are in the audience here, so you lived through this controversy. Tobacco Institute. Smoking and tobacco. The first suggestions that tobacco use, cigarette use, was associated with lung cancer came from German scientists, German doctors in the 1920s. You'll be, as just an interesting historical aside, for those of you who thought the Nazis couldn't do anything right, there was actually a fairly deliberate anti-smoking campaign by the Nazis during the 30s. I suspect because if you are the master race and want to take over the world, you can't have lung cancer. Whereas here in the United States, it was a little different picture. Tobacco companies here were developing milder forms of tobacco, ones where the smoke was a little more acidic, so it produced better taste, and they were promoting smoking. In cigarette use, you tend to inhale more than you do with whether it be pipes or cigars, which predated here the development of the cigarette. So through the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, cigarette use in this country increased dramatically. The height of cigarette use per capita was in 1965. It's diminished slowly ever since. Well, about the 1950s, American doctors are catching up with their German colleagues, kind of going, whoa, we're getting more evidence here of lung cancer, which used to be, at the turn of the century, a very unusual, very rare event. But there's been a radical increase here in lung cancer, and we think maybe it's got something to do with cigarette consumption. Well, if you're the president of a tobacco company and manufacturing cigarettes, what are you going to do? You're going to get together with your colleagues, 4 major American tobacco companies, all kicked in some cash and created the Tobacco Institute in 1958. And interestingly, that since it wasn't really clear what was the primary cause of lung cancer, originally they hired the best scientists that they could and said, you distribute this money out for studies that will show the real cause of lung cancer, or maybe it's genetic, or maybe it's environmental, or it's something other than us. It can't be us, because we're making millions of bucks. It's gotta be somewhere else. Well, the National Institute of Health, as well as various medical schools, were conducting their independent studies at the same time. And as these studies provide evidence regarding to the question, we know there's a positive correlation between smoking, increase in smoking and increase in lung cancer. We all know correlation does not prove causation, so the research will get to the causation. And as these studies are concluding and evidence is coming in, oops, it doesn't look like it's genetic or it's environmental, although those may be factors, of course, but they don't explain the exponential increase here in lung cancer. No, those studies that look directly at the use of tobacco in lung cancer make it pretty obvious that tobacco, the use of tobacco, smoking, cigarettes, is the major cause for lung cancer. Well, what are you going to do? Here you are, the president of a multinational, multi-million-dollar corporation. What are you going to do when you tried to find, hoping that the real source was somewhere else, but no, the spotlight stays on you? What are you going to do? What anyone would do. You turn to Madison Avenue. You want to change your science problem into a public relations problem. And if we throw enough money at it, maybe we can deflect the public's attention. So, first off, publish good news about tobacco. What good news? Well, they employ thousands of people, make a lot of income for all their investors, a major export. There's a lot of dirt poor farmers in the South whose only cash income comes from growing tobacco. So there's something good to say about tobacco. Point to that. Oh, remember those studies that the Tobacco Institute funded where the evidence kind of wasn't what we were expecting? Well, the scientists who did that, they get their credit, if you will, by publishing in peer-reviewed journals. That's the way the scientific community works. Yeah, well, you paid for those. It's yours. Claim proprietary rights and bury them. You don't have to publish those results. They're yours. Furthermore, let's collect data on public attitude towards smoking and possible health benefits of smoking. What do you mean? Well, everyone knows that if you want to be a tough guy, you got to have a cigarette dangling from your lips. You know, image. Why do people smoke? Some of it might be just, you know, the pleasure that comes directly from smoking. But maybe, you know, you want to be like the Marlboro Man or whatever. You got Joe Camel. The older folks, you remember the ads in the papers and the product placements in movies. And so the gratification that you might get in the short run being cool with a cigarette dangling from your lips is more important to you than lung cancer? Well, who, me? So yeah, you know, you don't have to give up. I mean, let's work this. Question scientific studies that put tobacco in a bad light, usually casting doubt on their reliability. Small sample. Well, this study and this study, yeah, you know, this one says 4.7, this one says 4.3. Clearly, you guys don't know, you know, you need to talk amongst yourselves and get it straight. See? Remember, now, keep your eye on the prize. What you don't want is Congress to pass legislation regulating your manufacture of cigarettes. So you focus your attention on the population. Study the smoking population, your customers. And we'll also lobby whoever would, you know, provide regulation. Legislators. At one time, the Tobacco Institute was considered as effective as the National Rifle Association is effective today. And no matter how much you might disagree with the National Rifle Association, you grudgingly have to admit, alarmingly so, they seem to be effective. They're doing the same sort of thing. Prevent regulation. You old-timers will remember here, I'm sure you'll think of all the fights we had, initiatives in California that went tobacco slowly, every decade or so, would lose a battle here, a battle there, till finally here in the late 1990s, a half century after the first scientific suggestion that there's a causal relationship between smoking and tobacco, only after whistleblowers within the tobacco industry, working for the Tobacco Institute, smuggled information out showing where these folks had lied to Congress, they had studies, they knew the effects, the addictive effects of tobacco, and lied to Congress, that the Tobacco Institute, in effect, was put out of business. With a $20 billion bill to reimburse states for expenditures that have been taken at the state level for tobacco-related injury. Remember, it's lobby the congressmen. Well, over the years, 50s, 60s, 70s, a little defeat here, a little postponement there, a little defeat there. Some of these techniques that were developed by the Tobacco Institute would include raise doubt about even the most indisputable scientific evidence. Admit nothing. Promote scientific spokespersons who misrepresent peer-reviewed scientific findings. Oh, who would that be? Well, remember, you probably heard the figure that 97% of climatologists today believe that global warming is real and it's human-induced. 97%. Well, that means there must be 3% then of folks that you would think would be qualified, where we're talking about limiting our discussion here to, climatologists. So there must be 3% of that population who doesn't go along with that. Those are the folks that we want to see if they would be willing to accept, money from us in order to express their views. Here's the idea. 97 men and women over here who are all qualified to talk about climate change, they're all in general agreement. You got 3 naysayers over here. Who knows, curmudgeons, whatever. Or maybe they just truly believe in whatever, their point of view. Well, possibly respect that. 97, 3. Let's get one from each and have a debate. Okay, and of course they won't agree on anything. Well, that looks then like the scientific community is kind of split 50-50 right down the middle. They can't agree on anything. We won't fight this in the peer-reviewed literature. We're going to dispute this in the media. Cherry-pick supporting evidence in an attempt to maintain the impression that debate is among scientists. Now, regarding the question of climate change, you know that CO2 in the atmosphere is less than 1%. It's actually a very small component of the air that you're breathing right now. Perhaps less than 0.5% CO2. If you take some trees, put them in an enclosure, airtight enclosure, pump it up with some extra CO2, vegetation loves that. They get better growth. That's called CO2 fertilization. Oh, well then an increase in CO2 in the atmosphere could be good. Huh? So this global warming thing, a lot of people in a panic over here say, ooh, the sky is falling. These scientist types. Well, we can cherry pick legitimate scientific, evidence that favors our side. Use the media to put forward positions rather than professional journals. Remember, it's the legislators, those are the folks that we want our message to get to, and they respond to their constituents, and therefore it's the public that we want to hear our message. We don't care about the scientists and their peer-reviewed literature. And remember, don't forget, if legislators believe that science is unclear or in dispute, there will be no regulation. There will be delay and a request for more study. And we're all in favor of more study, for sure. There in outline is the attitude, the approach of right-wing anti-science. Now, this starts with the Tobacco Institute in the 1950s, but we see it again with acid rain, starting in the 1960s. Sulfides are pumped out of the smokestacks of factories, turning the rain acidic downwind, changing the pH of streams and having serious environmental effects. Whose ox is getting bored? Well, I guess those businesses and companies that are pumping out the smoke. DDT. DDT was discovered in the 19th century. In the 1930s, it was discovered to have bad effects here on bugs. Whoa, well that's good. In fact, the scientist who discovered that received the Nobel Prize in Physiology in 1948. DDT was a miracle, absolutely harmless to you. It only gets the bugs. However, when you use it indiscriminately and in huge quantities, it does get into the waterways. It does change the environment. And in 1962, Rachel Carson wrote a very famous book, which I hope all of you will have the chance to read, called The Silent Spring. Oh God, there they go again. The sky is falling. Whose ox is getting gored? Chemical companies. This was supposed to, DDT was supposed to be a miracle.
Jim?
Yes?
Could you just describe what the ill effects of DDT were?
Well, as I understand it, I bet there may be some chemists in the room who can actually help me on this, but but it does get into the waterways and affects the development of fish.
Birds, it doesn't
Birds,
thin the shells.
thins the shells
eggs,
of eggs, right, going, because it accumulates. So you've got the great chain of being here, and it gets in at the bottom level, but accumulates here amongst predator and prey, and works its way up to the
apex.
The apex, if you will. So that the top, mostly birds. Thins out the shells, so that it's
And us.
and us, yeah. Ozone hole, CFCs. Again, I mean, as a molecule, if you get a man-made molecule that doesn't tend to degrade, doesn't interact with anything, it's fairly inert, I guess, chemically. Doesn't disappear either, but you use it in air conditioners and fire extinguishers and all sorts of stuff. You know, multi-million-dollar industries producing these things. Oh, there's just that nasty consequence about, though, when it gets up into the stratosphere, it tends to serve to destroy the ozone in the stratosphere. And again, two California scientists from UC Irvine, together with a Dutch scientist, received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1995 for having identified the chain connecting the dots of how CFCs destroy the ozone in the stratosphere. It's not just CFCs. The protocol here, that the Montreal Protocol here, which prohibits the production of things, the POP, P-O-P, persistent organic molecules. There's a whole bunch of them.
Maybe polycyclic aromatics.
Is that what it is? Like that. CFC is only one of them. There's a whole bunch of them. Just look up the Montreal Protocols and you'll see this long list of molecules, man-made molecules that have a long-range detrimental effect if just used. Secondhand smoke. You'll remember just the political fight that we had to go through here, even at the local level, for just getting restaurants being smoke-free or public spaces. You may not think of that today. I mean, nobody would think of lighting up a cigarette. When I went to Berkeley out of high school, you could smoke in the classroom. Yeah, that's how long ago it was. Right. Yeah, I mean, it was cool to sit there and listen to a lecture and light up. Inconceivable today. But that was a long, hard fight. And now we've got global warming. Now, the first suggestion that the atmosphere could possibly be warmed by an increase in CO2 occurred at the end of the 19th century by a Swedish scientist here, commenting about the Industrial Revolution and the burning of coal. But it was just kind of an aside. That would seem to be what you might expect. Just all but forgotten. But then as the problem becomes real, with an increasing use here of carbon use, petroleum, coal, by the 1970s, now we've got a clearly identified problem. It's been around for a while here. In fact, the problem is international. It's not just in the US or not just local. It's a worldwide problem. That's what we'll be talking about here in just a few minutes. There's a gathering in Paris that will be taking place here in the very near future by climatologists from all over the world to look at the problem and to come up with suggestions here for protocols, just as we refer to the Kyoto protocols or the Montreal protocol in response to an environmental issue. There may be, in some time in the future, the Paris protocols. And a self-appointed truth squad here, a former US Senator from Oklahoma, is going there by himself as a truth squad to set all those scientists right here. Okay? Well, where do these guys sort of, get their information? What do they believe? Remember I suggested that if you assume an anti-science stance, there's probably something that you value more. I don't think you become an anti-science just to be difficult. There must be something, I'm guessing. Well, right-wing anti-science, I'm suggesting, is a symptom of a market fundamentalism. What's that? Well, let's let the market, make these social decisions as opposed to politicians, basically. Environmentalists, by the way, are watermelons. Watermelons. Green on the outside, red on the inside. Now, this market fundamentalism goes back to the 80s. There's a history. You notice all the issues that I mentioned, they're all environmental issues. Because, scientists point to a problem, and environmental problems are viewed as, by environmentalists, as market failures in some sense, which require government to correct through regulation. This is seen by anti-scientists as creeping socialism. Economic freedom is seen as fundamental as civic freedom. Therefore, free markets must be defended as vigorously as free speech, free religion, or free assembly. Any problem defined by scientific input which could lead to further regulation will have the science attacked. There an outline is what's going on, from my perspective. Now, I referred to various think tanks that receive large donations from American corporations here, because all these problems usually involve somebody who's making a lot of money somewhere, and if these guys are right and government regulation gets implemented, the government's going to be saying you can't do that anymore, you got to do this way, you got to put whatever. Going to be affecting your bottom line. Well, there's certainly an economic impact. So you can understand, so is it just business greed? No, I think it's more than that. That's what I would call it here. No, I think it's an ideology, far more comprehensive than just greed. Here's some think tanks, and again, if you just Google conservative think tanks, come up a list of 50 or 100 of them. Well, what if I Google liberal think tanks? Oh, you'll come up with another 50 of them. Washington is filled with these things. But remember, the liberal think tanks aren't getting donations from corporations saying, put forward, your anti-science. Matter of fact, generally, left-wing think tanks aren't concerned with anti-science. We're generally pro-science. Whereas the right-wingers, Cato Institute, American Enterprise Institute, that's the granddaddy of them all. You watch here on the news when some conservative politician comes to town and is giving a speech before the press corps. If you look in the back, it'll always say AEI. AEI, what's that? The American Enterprise Institute. They host these folks. Every time the vice president, I'm having a senior moment, the one from Wyoming who...
Dick Cheney.
Dick Cheney. Every time he visits Washington, he speaks at the American Enterprise Institute. Heritage Foundation, Competitive Enterprise Institute, Heartland Institute, Discovery Institute, that's a Seattle-based institute. They're mostly concerned with creation science. Most of them have sort of an economic interest that they're promoting, market fundamentalism. The George C. Marshall Institute, though, is a special one. I've listed it last because we're going to sort of take a look at it now in greater detail. You might think, okay, Mr. Pedgrift, I think I got my mind wrapped around this anti-science thing, and okay, I'm following you here. But I got to think the folks that are promoting this stuff, I mean, they're not well versed in science. Surely they can't be. And they can't just be, curmudgeons. There's got to be more to it than that. No, there is. I think there's an ideology that supports that. But regarding the question of their scientific bona fides, look at the George C. Marshall Institute created in 1984. Here are the founding members. Whoops. My slide got hidden here. Let's see if I can find it. There it is. Got it. Thank you, Scott. Okay, 1984. These three gentlemen that we'll look at here in greater detail in just a minute originally came, this is 1984 would be the middle of the Reagan presidency. They came to the presidency with the suggestion here for the Strategic Defense Initiative. And again, some of you old timers will remember Star Wars. Okay, so we're in the middle of the Cold War. These folks are scientists, they're technicians. They're suggesting that we spend billions of dollars to develop a system that will detect all these missiles, those Soviet missiles coming over the polar ice cap, be able to spot them all and intercept them here with missiles that will blow them up, in the sky, so that they won't reach their targets here in America. And in return, we can bomb them back because they won't have a Star Wars system like we have. So that would certainly be a disinclination for those Ruskies ever doing anything nasty to us, for sure. Well, the principal opposition to this idea came from within the scientific community. In fact, it was scientists who were kind of going, holy cow, I mean, what you're proposing will suck all the money for research into this thing on something that's highly problematic without any real probability of success that you can actually do what you think you're going to do. Oh, and by the way, and Carl Sagan was instrumental with another half dozen of his colleagues that came up with the concept of nuclear winter. What's that? Well, let's say we intercept all the Soviet missiles and then we bomb the hell out of them, go in the other direction, and we've got all these nukes going off. That could create a cloud, drift up into the stratosphere, actually cover the entire planet, and entirely disrupt the web of life. I mean, you can have crop failures, everything works its way. In effect, with nuclear winter, if you think there's any plausibility to the concept of nuclear winter, what it implies is that there cannot be any winners in a nuclear exchange. You can't just block theirs and then bomb them in return and think that you're the winner. No, if nuclear winter has any plausibility at all, you have to avoid nuclear war. And if we're committed to that, we don't need to invest all this money in the Strategic Defense Initiative. These three gentlemen, that was their original concern. And who blocked their concern? The watermelons. Now, Frederick Seitz, president of the National Academy of Science, just in case you thought he was some know-nothing, no, president of the National Academy of Science, president of Rockefeller University. Oh, yeah, and by the way, consultant to the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company. Robert Jastrow, professor of earth sciences at Dartmouth University and founding member of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies. In fact, he was the director from 1961 to 1981. These are not jerks. These are not know-nothings. No. William Nirenberg, director of the Scripps Institute of Oceanography, member of the National Academy of Science Governing Council, worked on the Manhattan Project. These are patriots. Accomplished scientists who in their earlier years made significant contributions to science and who in their senior years turned to management administration and consulting the government. Okay? Well, these are not, ignorant people. They just have a different take on things. Well, these were the founding members of the George C. Marshall Institute. Now, what I'm going to do here, we won't worry about that. Let me, bad pedagogy, I know, I'm going to read to you something from the Marshall Institute. Now, if I could, I would, why should I read to you what you can read for yourself? Give you an assignment, have you come back next week so we can discuss, you can answer questions, write a paper and answer questions, but unfortunately we can't do that. So I want you, I'll be with you, fear not, we're going to go into the devil's den, we're going to read the devil's words uninterpreted by me. And you make up your mind as to what's going on here. I trust that you have enough background here to be able to make sense out of this. And say, I confess to the poor pedagogy here, but when you listen to this, it's just I'm doing well, because usually I drone on and it'll take more time than I have. I get excited. But we're going to have time for me to read this and hopefully have an opportunity for you to ask questions and make some observations and share your own thoughts on this right here. This is a document put out by the Marshall Institute, Climate Issues and Facts. This is the 4th edition of this particular document here. This is from 1915, Marshall Institute. Okay. Now, let me just make sure you understand. The George C. Marshall Institute, a nonprofit research group founded in 1984, is dedicated to fostering and preserving the integrity of science and public policy. That's what we're interested in, science and public policy. The Institute conducts technical assessments of scientific developments with a major impact on public policy and communicates the results of its analysis to the press, Congress, and the public in clear, readily understandable language. The Institute differs from other think tanks in its exclusive focus on areas of scientific importance, as well as a board whose composition reflects a high level of scientific credibility and technical expertise. Its emphasis is public policy and national security issues, primarily involving the physical sciences, in particular the areas of missile defense and global climate change. Now, how missile defense and climate change get mushed together, I have no idea, but historically, the Marshall Institute was concerned with the Strategic Defense Initiative, and now they're concentrating on climate change. Copyright, 2015, hot off the press. You can download this yourself here. Climate Issues and Facts, James V. DeLong. Now, the founding members all passed away a decade ago. Well, who's Mr. DeLong here? James V. DeLong is Vice President and Senior Analyst of the Convergence Law Institute, a nonprofit organization dedicated to research and education in public policy issues, especially the areas of energy, technology, intellectual property. He's an adjunct scholar with the Competitive Enterprise Institute in the heart of all those think tanks. They all share people and ideas. They're all coordinated, if not officially, at least they're all singing from the same hymnal, if you will. He's a senior analyst at the Competitive Enterprise Institute and vice president of the National Legal Center for the Public Interest. Mr. DeLong is a magna cum laude graduate of the Harvard Law School, where he was book review editor for the Harvard Law Review, just like President Obama. I'm impressed with his academic qualifications. He's certainly done better than I have academically. Oh, and he's a cum laude graduate of Harvard College, where he majored in U.S. history. So he's not a scientist, he's a lawyer, but he's certainly no dummy. He's got, definite academic success that you have to respect. Okay, well, what's he going to say? Well, there's some 23 questions that he answers in the text of this thing. We're not going to look at that. We are going to, if I can get to it, I'm going to read just the introduction. Now, what I ask you to do is say, as you listen to my words here, what's he trying to do? What's he trying to accomplish? And how's he doing it? If you had a homework assignment, it might be the answer to those two questions. What's his goal? What's he trying to do? And how is he trying to accomplish it? The purpose of this document is to identify fundamental questions about climate change and provide straightforward answers that separate fact from speculation and advocacy. The most important fact is that the repeated assertion that the science is settled is not only wrong, but contrary to the scientific process. Science is never settled. Theories are continuously refined by the discovery of new knowledge, and sometimes long-settled consensus is completely upended. Experts agree that the Earth's temperature has warmed slightly over the past 200 years, and the concentration of atmospheric carbon dioxide is higher than it was in the pre-industrial era, and that humans affect climate. Everything else is subject to debate. The degree of warming, the reliability of the temperature record, whether warming would be harmful, the causes of warming, the likely future path of global temperatures, the role of solar effects, the reliability of proxies such as ice cores, the effect of extreme weather, the major factors causing climate change, and more, all in dispute. The concern about a serious human impact on the climate system, while legitimately raised, has been exaggerated. No validated scientific knowledge confirms the proposition that human activities are having or will have adverse effects on the climate system, or that the world faces a climate crisis. In most fields of human endeavor, debate leads to the advancement of knowledge and understanding. That is not true in the climate change debate. Advocates of the view that catastrophic human-caused climate change is imminent attack those who disagree with them with a level of viciousness rarely seen outside of partisan politics. Those who challenge climate orthodoxy are called deniers, equating them to those who denied the Holocaust and perpetrators of crimes against humanity. Intensity of feeling does not promote accuracy of analysis and is a barrier to the discovery and resolution. An abundance of evidence establishes that the case put forward by the advocates of catastrophic climate change is imminent rests on shaky foundation. The complexity of the climate system and limitations of our state of knowledge have created opportunities for special interests, both ideological and economic, to advance their agenda, gave funding for research and subsidies for green energy, or enhance their personal reputations. Climate change is big business. The US government spends $21 billion a year on research, subsidies, and tax breaks, premised on the idea that the threat is real and immediate, and imposes uncounted but huge regulatory costs on the private sector as a consequence. Because climate debate is agenda-driven, it has short-circuited the rigors of the scientific process and serious journalism. In particular, too much emphasis has been placed on appeals to authority as a substitute for the laborious process of scientific study, hypothesis testing, validation, and replication. In effect, anti-scientists look at mainstream science and say, "You're pseudoscience." As a result, there is serious misunderstanding and confusion over what we actually know about the climate system, past climate changes and their causes, and human impacts on the climate system. There's also an unwarranted faith in and reliance on complex climate models. Much of the supposed consensus is embodied by the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The IPCC is a complex organization. While it draws on the work of distinguished scientists and technical experts, it's also subject to political pressures from the governments that lead it. Its summaries for policymakers, often the only document read by the press, are notorious for departing from the measured language of the technical experts in favor of alarmist views dictated by political needs, a habit first documented by a panel of the National Academy of Science in 2001. Although interest in climate is as old as mankind, climate science is a new field. It emerged only in the 1970s when advances in computer technology enabled development of complex climate models, when satellites became available to provide accurate temperature data, and more recently with the development of effective systems for measuring ocean temperatures. The time period between 1970 and today is too short to provide a comprehensive understanding of the processes that make up our complex climate system. The implications of policy decisions made, it is imperative that policymakers give greater weight to factual accuracy, the scientific process, and the many uncertainties in our understanding of the climate system. The current situation calls not for alarmism, but for continuing research to expand our understanding and a respect for the importance of abundant and affordable energy for the world's economic well-being. Okay, as it goes on, there's some 23 questions that he raises and answers. And say if you really find this interesting, you can download the PDF file from the Marshall Institute. That's the end of what I have for you. So I'd be interested in your questions or observations or any of your comments here. Right.
Who is George C. Marshall?
Oh, George C. the great leader of victory here in World War II, a five-star general, a winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, former Secretary of State, truly great American.
Marshall Plan, Joe.
Excuse me?
The Marshall
The
Plan.
Marshall Plan, the author of the Marshall Plan. Thank you very much. And who, by the way, died 20 years before the Institute was formed using his name, and I could only guess that if he were alive, he might have some questions about that. Yes?
You talk about anti-science as
Ideology.
media agenda. What about scientists that it feels like it's a distraction, and that say for the tobacco industry, since you use that as an example, there are scientists behind the scenes in the tobacco industry that are chemically changing the cigarettes to make them more addictive so that you can't get away from them. So are those scientists considered anti-science?
Oh, don't remember, anti-sciences are folks who work to delegitimize science. So, no, I'm sure you can have a scientist who's been given a job to somehow select tobacco that has an increase of nicotine in it, and you can say that that's just a scientific enterprise that he's doing. No, that's not anti-science. Anti-science is trying to delegitimize science in some sense. There are scientists who do bad things, build bombs or make poison gas or whatever, but that is not anti-science itself. It might be anti-human, but it's not anti-science. Other questions or comments? Yes?
More of a clarification.
Sure.
So this is anti-science or?
The Marshall Institute?
Right.
I think there's the fountainhead, if you will, of anti-science. Those are the self-appointed folks who by design, say we're the ones who are qualified to talk about science. Look at our board of directors. All these climatologists, they all have got PhDs. Well, so do we. So they're all saying X, Y, Z, and we go, no, you're.
Do they not have to have anything to back up? They don't have to have any evidence of their anti-science or?
Anti-science attempts to cast doubt on mainstream science.
So they don't actually prove it?
On wherever mainstream science raises questions about something that's usually got a business or a political consequence to it, an economic consequence, that would call for market regulation. You want to neutralize those scientific claims. And you do that by casting doubt. They're all arguing amongst themselves. No, a 97% consensus is pretty strong, really. I don't think there's a lot of doubt at all. But in the media, but see, we're not going to argue that in the professional journals. We're going to argue it in the press. And as long as you can have one PhD who can get up and say, well, I'm qualified to talk on this, and yeah, no, I think they're alarmists. In the public's mind, it looks like there's controversy everywhere.
I think you should make a distinction between anti-scientists who deny the legitimacy of the whole scientific method and say that it's Eurocentric, male-centric, etc., and people who claim to uphold the scientific method but just want to confuse the issues.
Yeah,
there's a difference.
Yeah, there is.
The author of this is not saying that science is illegitimate. He's saying the majority of scientists have jumped to conclusions, but the real scientific method calls for longer testing.
People who see something underway, a process, something is in progress here, and we can maybe even foresee a tipping point beyond which we've missed an opportunity to rein this in, might speak in somewhat alarming terms. So to say, oh no, we don't know enough to take any action is really the only strategy that they're trying to employ. And the easiest way to do that is say, my scientific standards are this high, so I'll be with you and ready to take regulatory action, but only after the science is this high, and you're down here. So, continue studying. And folks who go, well, if we talk this to death, we might miss an opportunity here to do something. If we need to do something, we probably need to do it sooner rather than later. They would argue, oh well, okay, but just make sure you're basing that on science that has a very high standard, perhaps even an unrealistic standard. So if the intent is to undermine the scientific community and their recommendations today, that's anti-science.
That's not the way you defined it at the beginning.
Yeah, anything you engage in that attempts to delegitimize science as it's represented by consensus science would be, I would call anti-science.
Sure, and I'm going to make a comment because I want to make it real clear to the audience. I see examples of anti-science wrapping itself up in the guise of science. And I think this is what you were trying to show by reading this. There's this sort of reasonable language in this.
Very much so, yeah.
But it's following a playbook that you showed us time and time again, which is, have your own people with their ideas to put forward that are going to cast doubt as to what people think, so that a 97.3% split will often be represented in the news as a 50-50 split. Or for my own, an example I use with students was a time where there was an anomalous, that means an odd result, in neutrinos, in the flight time of neutrinos, which is a fundamental small particle. And there was a test that showed perhaps it moved faster than the speed of light. And the scientists, and you'll read the paper, are very clear to say, we don't know what the cause of this result is. We're not going to hypothesize what this is, but if it's real, it would be really big news. And they write a very reasoned paper and put it out to the public, meaning the scientific community, to understand it. And I remember this, and let me give you a little bit more. All of a sudden, newspaper articles said, was Einstein wrong? Einstein's wrong, this and that. And that was, I got a bad feeling about it, and it's part of a delegitimization of science. There's a scientific process that's going to go through and say, can these things move faster than the speed of light? If they can, will Einstein's ideas, which allow us to have cell phones that give us GPS readings to where we are, if that idea was true, it doesn't invalidate all of his ideas. but it's often presented, anti-science will come in and present, well, if people are having a debate about something, that means let's not consider the weight of it. So this was an extraordinary claim, and it was found out in fairly short order that this was ending up being something as simple as a cable error. And I will say, at the time that this happened, there were all these articles saying Einstein is wrong, and it was not that long from then that I knew the shoe would drop. It was before we solved the problem, but a shoe dropped, meaning there was an editorial in the Wall Street Journal. You know, likely if I find out who wrote that, they were probably related to some of these groups, who said, if Einstein can be wrong, then all bets are off, let's not be concerned about our climate. Okay? So for me, it's very important when you see this work that Jim put together here, that you realize that anti-science, and Joe put forth this question, and I think we can see that it could come in form of many guises. It could be saying, well, science, we're going to say it's legit, but as long as there's any doubt, let's not do anything and put our heads in the sand. And I think that some of Jim's takeaways are that there are industries that have money in the game,
Very much so.
that they fund people to say this in a variety of ways, and they'll misrepresent science to say that, well, if 97 and 3 agree, or if the preponderance of evidence is showing something, as long as someone disagrees, we're allowed to ignore it. And we're saying,
Maybe not.
maybe not. So with that, let's thank Jim, and then we'll take more questions.